What's up, guys? Welcome back to my workbench and World of Modeling. Dan here, as always. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at quick weathering for a covered hopper like this brand new Tangent Trinity 4750 covered hopper here. I waited for years to do a car like this until the right model actually came out. These are former BNSF cars that are used in phosphate service, and these have a very unique rust pattern on the sides. And how I'm going to be doing this rust pattern is with sponge effects. So this is going to be the first car that I've done on this channel with full sponge effects for this style car, if that makes sense, because I've weathered 4750s on this channel before, and I've done sponge technique on this channel before, but not combined for this type of car. It's a little bit more tedious because you have to work around ribs, but I'm going to make this video specifically for around that technique so I can show you guys the way I tackle a project like this. It's a really unique car too, and I really wanted something to film, so here we are. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys this brand new Tangent model that has just come out from the factory. These are really nice modern Trinity 4750s. Again, this one is decorated for GACX, as you can see. Very striking former BNSF scheme with some pre-painted patches and stuff like that. Fantastic model. These are selling out fast at Tangent like any of their other 4750s are. So we're going to go ahead and set the camera up, unbox this thing, and take a look, and then get into the weathering. Alright, so let's go ahead and unbox this. Let's take a look here. These Tangent cars are usually very well packed. Well, that's not good. Sounds like the weight is shifting. That's a little unusual. I never had a Tangent with the weight popped off like that. Anyway, let's go ahead and take the cover off. Did that a little bit backwards, but that's okay. It's still got the car out. And I'll lift this out. Check the box for missing pieces. And we're good. Okay. Awesome. Let's go ahead and set these aside. This isn't an actual unboxing video, so I'm not going to talk about the packaging or anything like that. We're just looking at the model here. And so far, other than the obvious loose weight inside the car, I really like what I see. So, what I am seeing here is very vibrant paint. There's a lot of really nice detailing, as expected from a Tangent model. It has the modern Trinity style roof walk, late pads, and the different type of sill. This is a key feature, including the jacking pads and the different raised roof walks compared to, say, an older 4750. The Pullman standard 4750 is slightly different, at least up to the 80s models and stuff like that. For the most part, this is pretty much a different car, though the capacity is the same. Really nicely detailed hatches, really nice roof walk, of course. The brake detailing on these is exquisite, and what I really like about this car is all the individually painted grab irons. They're painted white on this car. That is really awesome. Tangent also has a brand new style of coupler lift bar. These have never been done before on any of their models as far as I know. This is a more common modern style coupler lift bar where it doesn't have that bend. It's just a straight bar, basically, if that makes any sense. So that's another key detail that they've modeled accurately here. Now, I'm going to have to kind of show this at a weird angle, but actually you can see the BNSF patch here, where the logo used to be, and then you can see the patch for the GACX lettering here. I think that's really, really nicely done. Interestingly enough, there's no data. It's only a GACX patch. There's no load limit or anything like that listed here. I'll have to check the prototype photos. That's kind of unusual. I thought that was a requirement for these cars, but this model does not have that. So that's pretty interesting. I actually have two of these. I'll have to check my other model and see if it has that or not. That might be prototypical, but I'm not sure. Obviously, with Tangent cars too, the factory printing and painting is exquisite. I've never had a Tangent model out of the box that had bad printing or lettering errors. These really are the finest standard of model that you can pretty much get next to Arrowhead or anything like that, but honestly Arrowhead doesn't really have anything to offer that I'm interested in. So look at that. There's the opposite end of the car. Again, that patching is really, really cool. It's subtle patching, though. You can see it would be so easy to just repaint this entire car and not model that, but it's a very subtle difference that's there, and it exists on the real cars. and Tangent modeled that accurately, and that's really cool to see. So it's awesome to finally have a model of this type of car in my hands. This is actually pretty cool. And I got quite a few of these, not just GACX, but they offer a number of other schemes, and they're getting eaten up fast. A lot of them are already sold out, but honestly a fantastic model. I'm really happy to see these. One other little point here is these have, of course, the nice Tangent modern trucks, and they have all of the printing and stenciling on the truck frames themselves. The only thing I'm noticing here that I will point out just real quick for this particular car is there's a patch of gray unpainted plastic right there. Take a look at this. There's why it's unpainted, is because it's not sitting flush. That's interesting. So there's another detail that should not be doing that. What we'll have to do is we'll just have to glue that up here inside the car body. I'm going to try to fix that. It looks like this one is also loose too, but that explains why we're seeing an unpainted part of this. It should not be like that. It should be tucked up in there. So that's the only discrepancy I have with this car, and also the fact that the interior weight is loose. And the way you're going to fix this is you're going to pop this roof walk off very carefully. Do not pick it up by the roof walk itself. Take an X-Acto chisel, for example. I don't have one on hand. A chisel blade. You stick it in between the car body and that little lip for the roof, and then you just carefully lift it out. Actually, I can do it on this. Let me show you. Basically, you just pop that out, and then you want to obviously make sure that these little pieces on the ends for the supports are removed. You just pop those out really carefully. Otherwise, those are going to get snagged and tear off, and then you can just pop the roof off once you do that. And then fix the weight, put everything back together. So yeah, I don't know if Tangent missed that car data there, but we're probably going to have to add that once this car is actually weathered. I'll wait to just repatch that until this thing's mostly completed. The other thing I did, I fixed the interior weight. So that's all taken care of, and then I just carefully put the roof walk back on and repositioned the little supports there, both ends. And now we have a model that's ready for weathering. So, preparation-wise, I'm not going to dull coat the car. I get a lot of questions still regarding about my dull coat application, really how I go about that. Normally when I start weathering a car, I do not use any dull coat or clear finish unless it's custom painted or I've added decals ahead of time. Then I'll do a light coat to seal everything in to protect them. But for the most part, I do not seal anything before I start. Just because I'm going to be doing some airbrush work to begin. We're going to be painting grime into all of these sill areas around the coupler boxes, and of course the prominent kick-up lines, and then a little bit of grime on the area around the roof walks, around the hatch, of course. Those are going to be areas that need to have that grime, so we're going to be blasting all that in with an airbrush. And then once we do all that, we'll clean areas up that we need to. So for example, if we get any overspray on the sides, over lettering, anything like that, we'll clean that up, and then I will dull coat seal the car. Not gloss coat, but dull coat. Never gloss coat over a weathered car. You always want to use dull coat. I do see people use gloss coat, and big mistake because you're going to ruin your rust. Rust is not glossy, and grime is not glossy. It's a very rare that you see a car like that where it gets a gloss finish or has a gloss to it over a lot of rust. Not that this car is extremely rusty, but you get the point. So yep, we're going to just go ahead and seal all this with the weathering work first, then we'll seal it with dull coat. Alright, so on to the weathering portion of the video, and to start off I'm going to be doing some airbrush work as I generally like to do. I consider airbrush work to be the primer weathering. I have two canisters of paint. One is a very thick mix of black and brown, and the other is a more diluted black and brown mix, and one will be used for more of the wash work, and the other will be used to do a lot of the thicker, heavier build-up like kick-up spray lines, things like that on the ends. You'll see how I kind of lay this out here. Generally I start with the underbody of the car because that's where the majority of this grime is going to be, and with a prototype like this, the weathering is not extensively heavy yet because the paint job was done sometime in the 2000s is when BNSF repainted a number of these cars. So basically I'm going in here and I'm doing a grime coat to the inner center sill, the bays, around the coupler pockets, places like that. Just remember, in general, most of that grime is going to be on the ends of the car, around the coupler pocket, on that beam meeting the bay, the end slope of the bay, and then of course the kick-up lines on the end sheet of the car on both ends. That's where the majority of that grime is going to be. So I like to go and do a very thin, even coat of this grime all the way around the car, and then once I've built it up on the majority of the ends there, then I can kind of even it out and transition it a little bit onto the sides of the bays, like I'm doing here. As you can see, I'm just slowly working that color onto the bays until I get it to a point where I'm happy with it. I'm not trying to do all of the grime work at once in one shot here. This is just the primer weathering, like I said. Later on we'll go back and add some oil work to this, maybe some powders, do some kick-up spray lines and things like that with the thicker, heavier grime spray that we'll see here. Once I'm satisfied with the underbody, I can now switch up to the top of the car. And generally I like to start around the hatches. The hatches are going to be where the majority of that grime is going to be built up. You know, you get a lot of load buildup and spillage and things like that. Especially on stuff like slope cars, that's where a lot of that rust is going to start, and it very quickly overwhelms and overtakes the top of the car. But in this case, again, being that this is not as old a car, or at least the paint job is in pretty good condition on this prototype, I'm going to keep the grime to a minimum. I'm just going to focus the majority of it on the area around the hatch to begin with, and once I'm satisfied with that, then I'll slowly work it out underneath the roof walk to meet the side of the car, where we're going to be doing mostly sponge work. There you can see I'm just doing some very thin, even passes, one at a time, carefully building that grime up. Not trying to overdo it, just little bits at a time. It's a little bit tricky because you have to work around a lot of those walkway supports, but the key here is just to hit it at different angles to try to blend everything out as best as you can. You want to avoid having any kind of shadow lines or anything like that because of those parts. It's a little tricky, I know, but once you've done a couple of these cars and you know how to work the airbrush under these areas, then you can kind of figure out what angles you need to use to avoid getting shadow effects from those little walkway supports. Again here, once I'm satisfied with that, I do a couple final coats to the area, and then I blend everything together, and then here I'm starting to work that grime up onto the walkway. Again, the walkway is going to be a high traffic area. That's going to be actually where the majority of the walking traffic is going to be. So this area is going to be pretty chipped up, it's going to be pretty banged up, and later on we're going to do some chipping effects and some heavy rust effects to that roof walk as well. Again, just doing the primer weathering here to get things going, to tint the paint down, give it a nice grime coat for the following steps. Moving into the heavier mix of acrylic paint here, I do a test spray to just kind of gauge just how much the thickness is, and if I need to make adjustments, now is the time to do it, whether that's adding a little bit more of the 70% isopropyl alcohol or adding a little bit more paint. In this case, I was satisfied with the mix, so I just went ahead and started applying it to the car. And here what I'm doing is I'm spraying on the kick-up lines. I'm doing small, thin passes, and the nice thing about this heavier coat of paint is that it's a much thicker saturating color, so it builds up very quickly. The other thing is that when you splatter the paint out of the gun like this, it creates realistic little fine splatters and cool little effects like that. Now, I will be adding some other splatter effects with the brush and a metal straight edge, as you'll see later, but this is just a good base effect again. This gives us the nice defined kick-up line across the bay there. It's going to basically be on the majority of the end slope there and the end of the bay, working across that little shaker pad there. You can see it just kind of meets the shaker pad and then dissolves away as you get farther towards the opposite end of the bay, moving towards the interior of the car, if that makes sense. Just a couple passes here is all you really need. You can see I just let it kind of set up a little bit, and once I'm satisfied with it, I can then meet the spray on the end of the sheet and go ahead and draw that on there with the airbrush. It starts working up pretty quickly, and again, that nice little bit of splatter that it provides with that effect as well is very, very nice. It's one of the few cases where splatter out of your airbrush is actually acceptable. So there you go. That's looking pretty good there. Once I'm satisfied, I can now move to the ends, and I'm going to use this end as a demonstration. I just make a couple quick passes with the air gun. I just try to keep it as straight as possible. I try to keep it on one line and not try to deviate from that line. You want your kick-up lines to be pretty defined, even though over time these get pretty heavy and they splatter out. There's still usually a defined line, and so again, that's why I was using that specific mixture. Now it's time to work on some oil paints here, and I've sealed the car up with dull coat, and I'm going to go ahead and start applying some sponge technique technique work to the sides. And the reason I'm using a sponge here, in this case, which is a cosmetic sponge, is because the particular kind of rust on this car is a patchy, textured rust that's a little bit hard to achieve using just brushes. I've done it with brushes before, but it's never the exact same result. Using a sponge gives you a much closer, much more realistic, dry, rotted, bubbly looking rust, if that makes sense. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking the sponge, I'm dipping it in just a little oil at a time, and then I'm carefully transferring that sponge to the model and working in one panel at a time. I'm not trying to take on too much at a time here, because with the sponge you can only work in specific areas at a time. You really got to take your time with this. The other catch with doing it on a car like this is that we have ribs to have to deal with. And when you work with the ribs, it's important that you work at different angles and try to get that paint to work right up to those ribs as best as you can. It's very important that you get it as close as you can to those ribs so that it looks nice and even. You don't want it to just have a clean line of separation between the panel and the rib where you can see a clean spot. You don't want that. You need to have all of it coated all the way up to the rib. I'm also not worried about getting any paint on the rib right now. There's none of this rust on the actual ribs, and what I'll simply do is go back and I'll take a little bit of thinner dipped in a Q-tip, and I'll just go and pass over those ribs and I'll clean them off. And that'll pretty much clean those up. That's all I'll have to worry about, but I'm just worried about the sides here. Working across the patches is a little bit more tricky because the patches are going to be fresher paint compared to the car body where that's the older paint. And so I'm just doing a little bit more of a lighter application of this paint to those areas. I'm just very carefully brushing it across and blending it out. If it's too heavy, if it's too much and it doesn't match up to the patchwork on the prototype, you can of course go back and clean this back off and then do it again. But just remember, working in those patched areas, keep it a little bit lighter and work around them. Make sure you build that rust up around the patching to give it that distinguished edge where you can clearly see the defined area of patching compared to the old paint where it's starting to rust. See, I'm just very gently going over it, and my camera's making it really hard to see it, but hopefully you can see that patch area where you can see I'm working around it, and then the car body itself has got more of that tone of rust. There in this shot you can see it a little bit better. You can see how I've blanched across the sides, and I got a really nice defined bubbly looking rust, as I like to call it. That sponge does a really good job of this. And at this point it's very important to let all this set up and dry for a couple days. Sponge oil application usually takes a little bit longer to dry up, so it's just very important that you let the car sit for a couple days. Then you can seal it with dull coat. Moving on to some fine detail work, I'm going to go ahead and start painting the lock bars and little hinges on the top of the hatch here. The hatch is obviously white. That's fiberglass that doesn't really weather up. You can get a little grime up there sometimes, but for the most part the fiberglass hatches keep pretty clean. It's the metal components of the hatch that get rusty, like those lock bars. And as you can see, I'm using some burnt umber acrylic paint here. I'm using a fine tip brush and I'm painting the rust right onto those little pieces. It's kind of tedious, I will admit, but it does give it a whole other level of realism when you paint these separate details because it makes them look like separate components, which they are on the real hatches. Instead of just having it all one color where it all just looks like one molded piece of plastic, this gives it that depth, it gives it that realism, and that's prototypical because those little parts are the first things to rust up, and the only things to rust up on a hatch like this. And so I just go in very carefully with the fine tip brush. In this case I'm using an Atlas 10.0 brush, and I just paint those little details. Well, I got the oil out. I'm now switching up to an older frayed medium-sized brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start applying a base layer of burnt umber oil to the top to represent some heavy chipping and some deterioration of the paint on top of those roof walks. Again, the roof walks get a lot of high traffic, and so they're going to get chipped up pretty easily. After I've let that dry, I can now go in and I can add a little bit of chipping effects. And what I'm actually using here is a silver fine tip Sharpie. And this guy here does some really interesting paint chipping where it looks like we're down to bare metal. Once I've used the Sharpie to make a couple passes over certain areas of these walkways, I can then go back and add a little bit more oil with my frayed out brush to kind of subdue the color in a little bit. But it's a nifty, quick little way of modeling some of this chipping. You can see I'm using a slightly smaller brush here, but again, it's a frayed out older brush. I generally use frayed out brushes to do this kind of oil application compared to using a newer flat bristle brush. And while we have that oil, again, I'm going to use the exact same brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start brush painting some of that oil out on the edges of the car here. And the key is just to make it random little patterns, little random rust pits, little scratches and scrapes and things like that. This gives us a nice realistic little detailed effect. While that dries, I can now switch up and move on to some powder work on the underbody. And I'm going to go ahead and follow up the kick-up lines on the underbody with a little bit of black powder. Again, I'm just painting some defined lines here, making a couple passes with a fine tip brush specifically for powders. Make sure you don't mix your brushes up between paint brushes and powder brushes. Use specific brushes for powders and specific brushes for your paints. That way you're not mixing them up. Very important here. There you can see I'm basically transferring that powder now to the bay, and I'm just going to work it out a little bit, but not too much here. This is just really the goal here is to try to maintain that fine line. I'm not trying to defer from that. I can add a little bit of that powder to other areas like on the gates, and then in some cases I can kind of streak that up a little bit, just like I'm doing here, as you can see. It creates a really nice defined realistic technique for the kick-up, and it's basically my standard for doing kick-up lines on covered hoppers. Once I've done all that, now I can model some mud splatter and kick-up, and this is going to be done with a little bit of thinned white and brown acrylic paint mixed together. I'm using a fine tip liner brush here, a coarser liner brush, a camel hair brush in this particular case, and I'm taking the edges of the bristles of the brush and scraping them across a straight edge to create splatter. And very quickly you get some realistic, convincing splatter effects across your base. And again, the majority of that splatter work is going to be on your end base. It's going to be on your end line, the slope sheet, for example. And again, you can work this across the base. There's going to generally be a lot of mud. And some of these prototypes, I mean, they get pretty muddy. So you can either go heavy or you can go light depending on your prototype. In this case, I went kind of moderate across the underbody there, just giving us some nice little detail effects. And it worked out really well. You can of course also go in and add some black and some browns and other colors if you'd like, but in this case I'm very satisfied with the mud splatter on the underbody. Now I'm going to start working on some load streaking and spillage, and in this case I'm going to use a little bit of acrylic paint. Sometimes I use oil, sometimes I use acrylic. In this case I'm just going to be doing some dry brushing techniques. I'm going to work some of that paint in around the hatch to model some of that load spillage. In this case this is phosphate. And so I'm just modeling some of that heavier, dustier streaking. The load gets spilled between the walkway and the hatch, and it starts to get watered down. As the rain meets it, it starts to streak down the sides. That's what generally happens. And here in this case, I just blend the paint out, and then I very carefully use a large flat tip brush and blend some of that out just a little bit to subdue it a little. And then I come back in, and I can continue to kind of blend it a little bit just to here in different spots. I'm going to start working it underneath those roof walks. I'm going to start blending it down the sides. Just working again mainly on the top of the car. Right now I'm just picking up some paint, and I'm dry brushing it by taking the paintbrush and scratching it across a paper towel or a napkin, and that gets you a nice buildup of the paint very quickly. And then once you're satisfied with the amount of paint you have, you can then take the brush and you can transfer it to the model like this. There you can see I'm just blending it out, very carefully working it under those little roof walk supports. Again, it's a bit tedious using a brush here because it wants to get caught up on everything, and with those little roof walk supports, they're a little bugger, but you got to do this. You got to work it out very carefully. Once I've gotten the paint blended out, then I can blend it further by pulling it out towards the edge of the car. We're not streaking it down just yet, we're just pulling the paint towards the edge of the car. Once I've done that, then I can take the exact same technique, just using a different brush here, and I can start blending that paint down the side of the car like this. I create very defined streaks using the acrylic paint here. If I was using oils, it would give me more of a thinned out wash effect, which works well for different prototypes, but in this case I want defined streaked lines, and so the acrylic dry paint work here and a camel hair flat bristle medium brush works wonderful for this trick. There you can see I'm just very carefully working it down in small areas at a time. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew, just work in small areas at a time. Work the paint out until you're satisfied. And again, I'm just doing this panel by panel kind of gauging it based on what I'm seeing in prototype photos of similar GACX cars. In this case, the patches of phosphate are pretty extensive, so I'm just working this paint down just like this, and very careful, slow motions of the hand. I'm not trying to work this down too fast. It's very important that you only go relatively slowly, and then once you get a defined line like that, you can just very carefully streak that paint down. It's very important too, you don't overwork this. Once you're satisfied with the level of streaking, stop and don't blend it any further, because you'll start to dilute the paint too much and you'll actually start pulling some of that paint from the top. The heavier application of this paint is always going to be at the top, because that's where the load spillage is going to start. It's going to fan out gradually as you get to the bottom of the car, just as a rule of thumb here. You can see how I'm starting at the top and then working it down. And it starts to subdue, it starts to settle down a little bit as it works more towards that bottom sill. Isn't that a nifty little trick though? It just creates such a cool little effect, especially for phosphate. I use this exact same technique when doing salt. Some fertilizers will also get you a similar result. Quicklime, maybe, but with quicklime I will pretty much generally use the oil, because the oil again will be a little bit more subdued. It won't give you as much of a streaked effect as is color. This gives me much more defined lines, as you can see. While I have that paint out, I'm going to go ahead and switch to a different brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start applying some powders to prep the trucks. I'm just doing a nice grime coat first off, and this is just a medium brown Monroe Models powder. I apply this to the truck frames, and then I do a little bit of that kick up and that mud splatter while I have the acrylic out here. I just like to go in and dab some on the trucks, just blend it out a little bit, and it creates a really nice realistic effect. And that's pretty much how I do the trucks on a lot of these cars. After everything's set and I was satisfied with the work, it was time to take it out to the diorama to photograph. And as you can see, it came out awesome. This car looks just fantastic. And I have a couple other prototypes planned with this similar type of weathering. I have another car coming very soon that'll actually demonstrate similar techniques here. That'll be coming down the pipeline. But as you can see, we got a lot of really nice grime. We got a lot of nice rust. The sponge rust just looks fantastic on this model. And having that load spillage and everything else just really completes the look of this car. I'm very satisfied with it. Hopefully you guys liked this video. If you did, subscribe here for more content and stay tuned for future videos. In particular, some more weathering videos coming and an update down the pipeline. Thank you so much for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.